They say it takes two to tango. But when Leonard-Lake and Charles Ng joined forces in the California hills, it wasn't dancing they had in mind. It takes two to make a nightmare come true.
And that's exactly what they did. This isn't Bonnie and Clyde. It isn't even Myra Hindley and Ian Brady. This is darker, colder. Together, Ng and Lake murdered entire families, built a bunker to enslave women, and recorded their horrors on videotape.
Welcome to Psycho Killer, shocking true crime stories. I'm Simon Ford, a journalist and lecturer.
And I'm Jacques Morrell, a retired major crime detective with extensive experience investigating homicides.
Today, we're exploring one of the most chilling partnerships in American criminal history, Charles Ng and Leonard-Lake. Let's start with Leonard-Lake. He was born in 1945, so his early adulthood coincided with one of the most turbulent moments in American history, the Vietnam War.
And Lake did serve in Vietnam, though not in frontline combat for long. He was a Marine, stationed mostly as a radar operator. But the experience had a profound effect on him. Like so many men of his generation, he returned home disillusioned, alienated, and disturbed.
How'd you get the nickname? The killer? Killed a couple of gooks in a bomb crater one time. Put a few 60 rounds into them.
It's something we touched on in our episode about American serial killers. The Vietnam War left scars not only on individuals, but on American society as a whole. Violence was normalized. Paranoia seeped into the culture, and authority, whether military or political, was no longer trusted.
And there's another important point. Most of the young men drafted to Vietnam were black. Yet, when we look at the wave of serial killers who emerged in the United States in the 1970s and 80s, they were overwhelmingly white men. White men just like Leonard-Lake.
So, correlation or coincidence?
It's not a simple cause and effect, but there's a pattern. White men who expected to be in control suddenly found themselves losing ground, culturally, politically, even sexually, in a decade of women's liberation. Some of them responded by trying to reassert control in the most extreme, pathological ways. Leonard-Lake was one of them.
Back in the 1960s, even before the Vietnam War, Lake was showing signs of instability. He was briefly married, but the marriage fell apart. He was first diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder, essentially someone who's socially detached, emotionally cold, and prone to fantasy.
Yes, and that's the dangerous combination. Schizoid personality disorder doesn't make someone violent, but in Lake's case, it fed his paranoia and his obsession with domination. He constructed an entire fantasy world, his so-called Miranda Project, where women would be enslaved and society rebuilt in his image.
That was Leonard-Lake, the dreamer, the fantasist, the manipulator. Then along came Charles Ng.
Ng was born in Hong Kong in 1960. His childhood was marked by violence. His father was brutal, physically abusive, controlling, and emotionally distant. That's the kind of environment that teaches a child fear instead of love, obedience instead of trust.
By the time he was a teenager, Ng had already started acting out. His father sent him to boarding school in England, but instead of turning him into a disciplined young man, it set him on a destructive path.
He couldn't cope. He was bullied, isolated, and he began stealing compulsively. Petty theft became his way of asserting control in a world where he had none. He was expelled after just one term for stealing from other students.
That pattern never left him. He moved to the United States as a young man, but the criminality followed: shoplifting, fraud, and military desertion. Ing was reckless, impulsive, and either unable or unwilling to learn from his mistakes.
And crucially, he was always looking for someone stronger to bond with. First the Marines, then Lake. Ing had no internal compass. He looked to others for direction, even when that direction was straight into darkness.
So here we have the dynamic. Leonard-Lake, the older man steeped in fantasy, paranoia, and control. And Charles Ing, the younger man, brutalized in childhood, lost in adolescence, drifting into adulthood, and ready to follow anyone who gave him structure.
It was a folie à deux, a madness shared by two. Lake provided the ideology, Ing provided the loyalty and the appetite for violence. Together, they became something neither would likely have been on their own.
I warn ya, I'm coming back to California. Lend me a shack and I'll perform ya all kinds of happy songs to ease your pain. Think of all we will gain. We'll be sunny until it starts to rain.
By the early 1980s, Leonard-Lake and Charles Ing were settled at a cabin in Wileysville, California. On the surface, it appeared to be a survivalist retreat. In reality, it was a death camp.
Lake had spent years sketching out his Miranda project. The plan was to kidnap women, imprison them underground, and force them into sexual servitude. He believed that after an inevitable nuclear holocaust, he would emerge as a kind of warlord, repopulating society on his own terms.
The cabin had an underground bunker, complete with concrete walls and steel doors hidden from view. There were multiple rooms, a workshop, a storeroom, and most chillingly, a soundproof cell for captives. This wasn't improvised. It was carefully planned and deliberately built.
And the way they selected victims was opportunistic, but always with control in mind. Whole families disappeared. Men and children were killed quickly because they weren't valuable. Women were kept alive, degraded, and filmed.
One of the earliest known victims was a young man named Donald Lake, Leonard's own brother. Donald had apparently asked questions about the bunker and the stockpiling of weapons. He vanished without a trace. That shows just how cold Leonard-Lake could be. Family ties meant nothing compared to his project.
And it escalated from there. The pair lured neighbours, handymen, even complete strangers. If someone had a car or tools, or simply got too close, they were fair game.
There were families like Harvey and Deborah Dubbs, their baby Sean, and a friend who happened to be visiting. All disappeared. It's believed they were killed so that Lake and Ing could take Deborah as a captive. The child was disposable. The woman was property.
The horror of what happened inside the bunker is captured on videotape. Ing and Lake filmed themselves taunting and terrorizing their victims. They talked about obedience and serving them. The women are visibly terrified, pleading for their lives.
One tape shows Lake telling a woman, "If you'll give yourself totally to me, you won't be harmed." That's the level of manipulation. He was promising survival if they submitted, when in reality, survival was never on offer.
What makes those tapes so disturbing is the complete lack of empathy. Ing laughs in the background. Lake speaks with calm authority, as though he's teaching a class. It's the banality of evil captured on VHS.
And there were children. That's the part many accounts downplay. Several children are believed to have been murdered simply because they couldn't be controlled or were inconvenient.
Exactly. This wasn't just sexual sadism, it was annihilation. They were erasing entire family units, and that tells us something important about the psychology of this. It wasn't about pleasure alone, it was about power, absolute power.
In total, investigators linked Ing and Lake to at least 11 known murders, but the actual number may be much higher. 30 to 40 pounds of bone fragments were recovered from the property, far more than could be accounted for by the identified victims.
So the full scale of their killing may never be known, which is often the case with serial offenders. The headlines give us a number, 11, but behind that number are countless families who never saw their loved ones again.
And that's why the videotapes became such crucial evidence. They didn't just show the brutality, they proved the intent. Ing and Lake weren't improvising, they had a plan, executed it, and documented the results.
Which is rare. Most serial killers operate in secrecy, hiding their crimes. Lake and Ing, by filming themselves, left a grotesque archive. They wanted to remember. They wanted to relive the experience of domination over and over again.
That's what makes this case so chilling. It wasn't just the killings, it was the methodical planning, the total disregard for human life, and the way they transformed that quiet Californian cabin into a slaughterhouse. Let's zoom out from the bunker and talk about how two men became more dangerous together than either was alone. Now, this is a question for you, Jack, with your decades of experience bringing serious criminals to justice. What makes a killer combination?
Okay, well, a helpful starting point is folie à deux, madness for two. In clinical terms, it's shared psychotic disorder. One dominant personality, the primary inducer, imposes a delusional system on a more dependent, secondary acceptor in a close, isolating relationship. Separation often weakens the secondary's belief, which tells you how much the dyad itself sustains the pathology. Lake reads as the inducer, Ing, the acceptor who amplifies the fantasy with action.
So the relationship is the incubator, I suppose. What's the mechanism inside that incubator?
There's two layers. First, interpersonal complementarity. It's a big word, but people tend to fit along dominance-submission lines. A dominant controlling offender evokes compliance and enactment from a submissive or dependent partner. That's classic Lake-Ing. Lake's grandiose paranoid control meets Ing's dependency and impulsivity. That fit stabilizes the partnership and channels it towards action.
That's fascinating. And the secondary layer, the second layer?
Well, that's moral disengagement. In a dyad, responsibility gets diluted. I'm not the only one. We decided this together. Can you see? Diffusion and displacement of responsibility. Euphemistic labeling. The Miranda Project. Advantageous comparison. Others do worse, don't they? And dehumanization of victims. Lab studies and offender research show that co-offending lowers perceived personal responsibility and activates these disengagement tricks. That makes each new step easier than the last.
Which, I suppose, explains why the violence didn't plateau. It escalated, it got worse, didn't it?
There's also a contagion effect. Prior co-offending predicts future violence more strongly than prior solo offending. Once a pair commits violence together, the threshold drops for doing it again, together. With Lake and Ing, shoplifting and petty theft harden into kidnapping and murder, because the partnership rewards greater risk with greater mutual validation.
Okay, let's put some labels on the Lake-Ing dynamic that listeners can carry into future episodes?
Well, there's three big ones. Okay, 1, dominant instrumental dyad, the ideologue plus the implementer. Lake is dominant, controlled, supplying the framework. Ing is instrumental, eager, impulsive, seeking structure. That's interpersonal complementarity on the dominance axis. 2 is known as closed world effect. The pair isolates socially. A rural compound, survivalist law, end of times bunker, so outside reality checks vanish. Proximity and isolation are textbook conditions for shared delusional systems to deepen. And 3, mutual radicalization. Each man's worst ideas sound normal when echoed back by the other. That accelerates moral disengagement, we language, task splitting, and taped rituals that reaffirm the ideology.
There's also the power theme. These weren't thrill kills, they were controlled kills, weren't they?
Exactly. In clinical language, you talk about the dominance behavioral system, trait-level drives to acquire and defend status and control. In some offenders, that system is overactivated and fused with callousness, producing instrumental aggression, violence used to secure obedience. The videotapes are pure dominance theatre.
So, to summarise the killer combination recipe, our series will keep testing.
You need 1, a complementary fit, dominant planner plus dependent executor. 2, closed world isolation to incubate a shared belief. 3, moral disengagement routines that dissolve personal guilt. And 4, co-offending momentum. Each successful crime lowers the bar for the next. When those align, it takes 2, stops being a metaphor, and becomes a mechanism.
And in Lake and Ing, all 4 were present and recorded. Let's bring this back to the Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, the PCLR. 20 items scored up to 40 points. 30 or above in the US is usually considered psychopathic, the threshold slightly lower in the UK and Europe.
Let's start with Leonard-Lake. Now he ticks a lot of boxes. Grandiose sense of self-worth. The Miranda Project proves that one. Pathological lying and manipulation. Well, he did that to family, friends, and victims. Callousness and lack of empathy. That was self-evident from the videotapes. Parasitic lifestyle. Well, he was living off thefts, scams, and other people's resources. And the big one, criminal versatility. From fraud and theft to murder, he covered the spectrum. I'd score him in the high 30s, well into the psychopathic range.
Okay, and Charles Ing?
Well, he's more complicated. He does show some psychopathic traits though. Impulsivity and irresponsibility. That compulsive shoplifting, deserting the Marines, endless petty crime. Lack of empathy. Well, we know about him laughing at his victim's terror. Failure to accept responsibility. Well, his endless legal appeals and shifting blame. But Ing doesn't show the same level of planning or charisma. He wasn't the grandiose ideologue. He was a follower. His score might be in the mid-20s, even high 20s, but not necessarily crossing the psychopathy threshold.
Well, not in the United States at least, but in Europe, different story. So, Lake, the full spectrum psychopath, Ing, the dependent, impulsive partner with psychopathic traits.
Right, and this brings us back to the theme of this series. Individually, they might have remained petty criminals or bitter fantasists, but together, it took 2 to make a nightmare come true.
By 1985, Leonard-Lake and Charles Ing had left a trail of devastation. Families wiped out, women kidnapped, raped and murdered, children brutally silenced. But like so many killers, it wasn't brilliant policing that brought them down. It was almost banal. It was shoplifting.
That's right. In June 1985, Ing was caught trying to steal a vice from a hardware store in South San Francisco. Lake was waiting in the car. When police confronted them, Ing fled and Lake was arrested. But in custody, he did something dramatic. He swallowed cyanide hidden in his clothing. Within hours, Lake was dead.
The police then searched Lake's cabin in Wyliersville, California. What they found was a nightmare made real. Torture chambers, videotapes documenting unspeakable acts, and shallow graves littered across the property. In the end, investigators recovered the remains of, as we've said, at least 11 people, though Lake and Ing are believed to have killed as many as 25.
Ing, meanwhile, had fled across the border to Canada, but his freedom didn't last long. Within weeks, he was arrested in Calgary after shooting a store security guard during another theft. That landed him in prison, but extraditing him to the United States, that turned into a saga of its own.
You see, Canada at the time had abolished the death penalty, and California, where Ing was wanted, still had it. Ing's lawyers fought extradition for years, arguing he would face execution if sent back. It took a long, grinding legal battle before Canada relented, only after California promised not to pursue the death penalty.
And then came one of the most expensive trials in US history. Ing was finally extradited in 1991, but his trial didn't begin until 1998. By the time it was over, the cost had ballooned past $20 million, more than the O.J. Simpson trial.
Part of the reason was Ing's behaviour. He constantly disrupted proceedings, filed endless motions, and went through multiple legal teams. He seemed determined to drag it out for as long as possible.
We, the jury in the above entitled case, find the defendant, Charles Cheetah Ing, guilty of the murder of Harvey Dubbs as charged in count 3. We further find the murder to be of the first degree. We, the jury...
Eventually, he was convicted of 11 murders and sentenced to death. To this day, he remains on death row at California Medical Facility in Solano County, California. No executions have taken place in California since 2006.
It's worth asking, how did they get away with it for so long? And this is something we've talked about in other episodes of Psycho Killer. Fragmented law enforcement, poor communication across counties and states, and the sheer distances in America. All of this created blind spots that killers like Ing and Lake exploited.
And the victims went missing in different jurisdictions too. Some were written off as runaways, while others were attributed to family disputes. The pattern only became visible when the cabin was uncovered, and by then, far too many lives had been destroyed.
And that brings us to the victims. The headlines remember the killers, but it's the victims we should never forget. Men, women, children, people with names, families, futures. Some we do know, the Bond family, the Dubberts, the Sharps. Others vanished into the woods around Wyliersville and were never conclusively identified.
Their lives were more than footnotes in Lake and Ing's story. They're the reason we're telling it.
Most serial killers act alone, but Lake and Ing proved that two can be far deadlier than one. This wasn't a partnership, it was a collision, and the victims never stood a chance. Individually they were dangerous, together they were unstoppable.
If you found this episode compelling, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss a story. And if you'd like to support Psycho Killer and help us keep digging into these cases, why not consider joining us on Patreon? Your support truly makes a difference.
And don't forget, the headlines remember the killers, but we also remember the victims. I'm Simon Ford.
And I'm Jacques Morrell.
Thanks for listening to Psycho Killer.
shocking true crime stories.